Okay, and welcome to another episode of Dimwits, Dipshots, Dufuses, and Dullards. And as I always have to explain, I call it Dipshots because YouTube doesn't like it if you swear in the first couple minutes of a video, and we're trying to build up an audience on YouTube and other places. So if it wasn't for that, I might be swearing up a storm at the start of every video, but for a few minutes, I have to kind of try to keep it PG, maybe even G rated, I don't know. But anyway, this episode is probably going to be a little bit controversial because I'm going to be looking at Eric Adams, and I'm also going to be looking at Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam. And I'm going to be critiquing these people. I'll just put it simply. So, Eric Adams is our quadruple D of the week. And why is that? Well, Mayor Eric Adams has announced his decision to bypass New York City's Democratic primary and seek selection as an independent candidate, a move that distances him further from the city's predominant political party. So, that alone, to me, is not scandalous. But it gets worse as you go deeper and deeper into detail here. In an exclusive interview with Politico, Adams expressed his intent to, quote, mount a real independent campaign, end quote, focusing on a solid base of people outside Manhattan, particularly ethnic minorities who were instrumental in his initial election victory. I almost said primary again. But that's again not that bad so far, right? It's normal. He reflected on the impact of federal bribery charges. Here's where the scandal starts to come in big time. They were filed against him in September 2024, and they were dismissed by a judge recently, stating that these allegations had, you know, uh, Eric Adams was stating that these allegations handcuffed him. Hemmed. I said hemmed. I blame this cold that I've got. You might be able to tell that I have a cold. I even just had a cough drop. But anyway, according to Wikipedia, and their entry here is adequately sourced. It has numerous New York Times articles linked and whatnot. But anyway, they say that Adams is accused of receiving luxury travel and other benefits from Turkish individuals, namely a government official and several businessmen. This included Adams pressuring the New York City Fire Department to open a Turkish consular building without a fire inspection, allegedly in order to cover up his misconduct. Adams created and instructed others to make false paper trails indicating he actually paid for these trips in full. So that's just corruption right there. You know, creating a false paper trail, that's deliberately trying to cover up a crime, allegedly. I have to say that for the legal reasons. Even though I don't have a lawyer here, looking over my shoulder or anything like that, I still know the rules of the game. You have to say allegedly. So keep that in mind if you're ever going to do a podcast or anything like this yourself. You have to make pals with the word allegedly or alleged. So Wikipedia also notes the efforts by the new Trump administration to dismiss the case came in the same week as the administration was negotiating with the mayor over immigration enforcement initiatives, and White House Executive Associate Director of Enforcement and Removal Operations, boy, that's quite a mouthful right there, Tom Homan, saying during a joint interview with Adams that if Adams did not cooperate on immigration, Homan would then visit Adams' office up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to? So earlier, Adams had agreed with Homan to give access to the city's Riker Island jail for ICE without violating the city's sanctuary laws via a loophole Adams appears to have found. Adams then joined Homan in a joint interview conducted by Dr. Phil McGraw, the bald guy who sounds like Droopy when he talks. You know, Droopy, the cartoon dog from back in the day. Well, look him up if you've never, heard of Droopy, and you can do a comparison between him and Dr. Phil. Granted, Dr. Phil kind of speaks faster than Droopy, but I think you'll get the comparison. But the joint interviews thing, the collaborating with ICE, the corruption, the getting Trump's DOJ to call for the charges to be dropped. That does not paint a good picture of Eric Adams. So Adams described himself as a racehorse that has been held back. Well, gee, you're kind of holding yourself back by creating these scandals and breaking the law. All these people, they want to play the victims and act like, oh, it's just these roadblocks are being put in my way. The very fact that they see them as mere roadblocks kind of suggests that these people have some power and privilege. They're able to just kind of shrug these things off, dismiss them, or whatever. It's almost like they know they have the upper hand in a lot of these cases, because he was just talking about himself being a racehorse that's been held back. There's something. There's something to that psychology there, where you just see yourself not only as a victim, but paint yourself in almost sort of a silly light, like just being a racehorse. It suggests people who are not taking these things seriously and who kind of view them as if they're somewhat of a joke or something like that. When really in this case the evidence was apparently pretty clear. I mean, if they had evidence of a fabricated paper trail, as the New York Times suggests, that sort of thing doesn't normally find its way into a courtroom unless they have been substantiated to some degree. Because guess what? If something ends up in a courtroom, it can pretty easily actually get thrown out if it can be proven that the evidence is flimsy. Because a courtroom, it actually has some standards. That's why it's a little bit disheartening to see so many of these cases get thrown out, because it's not because they didn't have evidence. It's because there's corruption apparently in the court system. And, when you have a DOJ like the one that's currently in operation, especially, there's a lot of stuff that is allowed to happen. And of course, even with the Biden era, the Merrick Garlandization of the DOJ assured that Trump would not actually spend even a day in jail. He didn't go to prison on anything. And of course, there are so many other politicians and powerful people who are just let off the hook, and that goes back quite a long ways. I could go on and on about that, but back to Adams. You know, he was saying he was ready to campaign without these constraints. He plans to submit the required 3,750 signatures by May 27th to secure a spot on the November ballot under a public safety focused line. A campaign video is set for release, I think today, meaning Thursday, the 3rd of April 2025. And, it's supposed to launch his campaign. And, it's going to be talking about his personal challenges. And he'll apparently acknowledge lapses in judgment and criticize opponents for being lenient on crime. Themes that sound all too familiar in right wing circles. So, this development sets the stage for a contentious election in the nation's largest city, which experienced a slight shift to the right in the previous November elections. Well, at least in terms of turnout. I don't know. I don't know to what extent there was any sort of voter suppression there, but for the most part, it sounds like Adams does have a chance. The race will likely feature a contest between Adams, who has notable ties to President Donald Trump now, and the Democratic primary winner, with former Governor Andrew Cuomo currently leading the Democratic field. Now, I don't know if that's going to change, but that's currently, at least from what I understand, who might be running there under the Democratic ticket. So, Adams acknowledged the significant challenges ahead, persuading traditionally Democratic voters to support an unaffiliated incumbent with a 20% approval rating. Think about that, 20% approval. That's pretty low. And he'll be defending a record that includes more criticism of his own party than of Trump, as Politico notes, and overcoming a financial disadvantage after being denied over $4 million in public matching funds. Now, I don't know that much about that. I'm not that much of an expert on the financing of campaigns, but it doesn't sound good. Despite these obstacles, he remains committed to the race, stating, I'm in the race to the end. I'm not running on the Democratic line. I'm just not realistic, or it's just not realistic to turn around my numbers and to run a good campaign from where we are right now. It hurts like hell. Oh, the poor baby. See, that's a cute way of addressing a corruption scandal like that. So, from a more positive perspective, let's try to put aside some of the criticism of Adams. You might see his decision to run as an independent as a move away from traditional party structures, potentially opening the political arena to more diverse voices, reducing the influence of entrenched party politics, etc., etc. A person might see it as a fresh start. However, his close associations with figures like Donald Trump and his focus on public safety, which in reality means giving more power to an unaccountable police force, well, it might raise concerns about the perpetuation of authoritarian governance and the expansion of policing powers. These are, some of the problems that New York City has had because you had previously Mayor Bloomberg, Mike Stop and Frisk Bloomberg, who was criticized for having policies like that. And it's just a pretty standard operating procedure for not just Republicans but also Democrats, unfortunately, for them to just in many cases look the other way while expanding the ability for police to get away with some actual crimes. So, an optimist, or one who is easily duped, perhaps, might view this candidacy as an opportunity to challenge the existing political framework and advocate for more, I guess, decentralized, community based approaches to governance and public safety. But to be brutally honest, that sounds kind of stupid in the context of Eric Adams. So, public safety, I think, will actually be threatened by somebody like him. And ironically, now this will also be potentially controversial for me to say, but Curtis Sliwa, the Republican who ran previously against Adams, might actually be better for New York than Adams. So that's a little bit of a controversial thing. And I'm not a fan of Curtis Sliwa. I do want to make that clear. I'm not like trying to be a cheerleader for him because he has been an immigrant basher and other things. And he's even admitted to faking some of the subway rescues that happened to promote the Guardian Angels, the unarmed crime prevention group, or some might call it a vigilante justice group or a mob. Um, but he apparently admitted to faking some of those, the rescues for publicity purposes and to put a positive spin on the guardian angels. So those are already two, fairly controversial aspects of this character. So don't get it twisted. I'm not saying he's like the greatest, most unflawed candidate ever or anything like that. In fact, he kind of sucks actually in some key respects. But sort of ironically, again, Sliwa might still be more progressive in some respects than Eric Adams. That shows just how much Eric Adams sucks, and Adams is really only likely to get worse. But here's what I mean: Sliwa actually did not support Trump in either 2016 or 2020, at least from what I understand, and he does not support Trump's election denial stuff. So that's already surprising. Now, Eric Adams seems to owe Trump something, so he might be more on a pro Trump bandwagon. He might be a Trojan horse candidate, even if he sort of portrays himself as, a relatively progressive guy. We know that he kind of owes his freedom to Donald Trump. Adams does. In contrast, Sliwa was a critique. He was he made critiques of the Trump administration and the election denying Republicans. Sliwa, at least during his last campaign, advocated against working class residents paying higher property taxes than wealthy citizens. So that might surprise some people out there. He wanted to make all animal shelters no kill shelters, indicating that he's a relatively humane person. In contrast to that, what is her name, Christy Nome, who shot a puppy in a gravel pit. Is that Christy Nome? I gotta look that up quickly. Christy Nome gravel pit. Let's see if it's her. Oh yeah, it was Christy Nome. she killed a like that was her confession and her autobiography. If most people like killed a puppy or something, they would leave it out of their bio. Like when I was a kid, I'll admit that I killed a frog. Um, but I wouldn't speak of that glowingly. I regret doing that. Just like you give a little kid a BB gun or something, they might shoot a bird or something like that, or a chipmunk or a squirrel. I mean, little kids are sadistic bastards. But she seemed to like write about that in glowing terms, which kind of makes a difference. So yes, I'm going on record saying that I once killed a frog. So maybe I shouldn't run for political office, right? But the point is, this Curtis Sliwa guy is, you know, not as bad perhaps as Adams. And here's the real thing here that might be surprising. Curtis Sliwa even said that if elected, he wanted to test out the feasibility of universal basic income in New York City. So what the hell, man? How is this guy probably more progressive than a lot of other actual Democrats? That's strange, you know. So again, boy, I hate to sound like I'm a cheerleader for the guy, but compared to Adams, he might be the better candidate. I feel weird saying that, but it's true. So to me, some of these things sound genuinely progressive-ish. So ironically, if the race ends up between himself and Adams, or the Dems just pick a candidate who's no more progressive than Adams, Sliwa might actually be the most progressive candidate in the race. And keep in mind, sometimes they might have these Trojan horses, like John Fetterman was a Trojan horse, Kirsten Sinema was a Trojan horse. They ran as being progressive, but when they got in there, they were in many ways not that way. So you have to be on the lookout for that. You got to look for some telltale signs. So hopefully the Dems pick somebody relatively good, and maybe that candidate could win. And hey, maybe borrow some of the ideas that Sliwa ran on in, the last campaign, which again were surprisingly progressive for a Republican in the year of 2021. So okay, I've talked about Adams and Sliwa, and now I'm getting to the second segment, which is the peripheral poop head of the week. And I'm coming up with sort of an odd choice here. Louis Farrakhan. So, how is he relevant? Why am I just bringing him up out of the blue? Well, at least according to what I've read in Eric Adams' biography, Adams had met with the uh, Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan and appeared on stage with him at an event. So that alone does not constitute a crime. When you're in politics, you sometimes do, you know, rub elbows with people you wouldn't normally expect. You sometimes have to negotiate with terrorists or whatever. Um, but Louis Farrakhan, he's a mixed bag of a figure at best, and I'm going to get into that here. So Adams apparently suggested that the early 90s New York City Mayor David Dinkins meet with Farrakhan and hire the Nation of Islam Security Company to patrol housing projects. So let me go over why this is bad and a sign of Eric Adams' questionable judgment. So some of you have probably heard of Louis Farrakhan or the Nation of Islam, and you may have heard good things about him. You may have heard bad things about him, but I'm kind of gonna get into the questionable things here. And as I go on, I will show you how I'm not just picking on the Nation of Islam or Louis Farrakhan or even Eric Adams, but I want to demonstrate how these people and organizations created scandals for themselves that anybody can comment on and critique. Right? It's not just me being bigoted or unfair here. I'm trying to sort of make you better understand how that sort of thing does not bode well for Eric Adams to be, you know, buddy buddy with somebody like this. So, why was it iffy for Adams to appear with Louis Farrakhan and to apparently want the Nation of Islam to provide security for housing projects in New York City? Well, let's take a quick look at Farrakhan with both good and bad things mentioned and see where the critiques might fairly emerge. I'm going to try to not be accused of being unfair, but Louis Farrakhan, he was born Louis Eugene Walcott in 1933 in the Bronx of New York City. He's, of course, a prominent and polarizing figure in American religious and political spheres. He leads the Nation of Islam, or NOI, uh, which is a black political and religious movement founded in 1930 that combines elements of traditional Islam with black nationalist ideas. As far as his early life and musical career go, Farrakhan's parents, Sarah Mae Manning from St. Kitts and Percival Clark from Jamaica, separated before his birth. He was raised by his mother and stepfather, Louis Walcott, and he grew up in a West Indian immigrant household. In his youth, Farrakhan was a talented musician and performed as a calypso singer under the stage name Calypso Gene. So, really nothing controversial there as far as I'm concerned. A relatively benign, you know, history in his youth. So that's not scandalous in my book. But his rise in the Nation of Islam is where the controversy started to more become apparent in his little biography here. So in 1955, after attending a speech by Malcolm X, Farrakhan joined the NOI, adopting the name Louis X before later becoming Louis Farrakhan. He quickly rose through the ranks, serving as the Minister of Mosques in Boston and Harlem. Elijah Muhammad, the then leader of the NOI, appointed him as the national representative, a position that made him one of the organization's most influential figures. So far, for just looking at those basic facts, not that controversial actually. Then there's the leadership and the Million Man March aspect of his biography. Following Elijah Muhammad's death in 1975, the NOI underwent significant changes under the leadership. Who and One of the leaders wanted to go in a different direction. Farrakhan split from the group and reestablished the NOI in 1977, maintaining its original teachings and structure. He set up the headquarters at Mosque Mariam in Chicago. In October 1995, Farrakhan organized the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., a gathering aimed at promoting unity and self reliance among African American men. The event attracted hundreds of thousands of participants, not quite millions, but hundreds of thousands, and was a significant moment in the history of black activism in the United States. So, that so far doesn't sound that bad, but the controversies and criticisms start to come in when you look at the statements about Jewish people, white people, and the LGBTQ community. So organizations such as the Anti Defamation League, or ADL, which itself has its own controversies, but you also have the Southern Poverty Law Center, which labeled him an extremist due to his anti Semitic and racist remarks. For instance, in a 2018 speech, he referred to Jewish people as satanic, a statement that drew widespread condemnation. His rhetoric also included derogatory comments about white people and conspiracy theories about government actions against black Americans. These statements have led to his denouncement by various civil rights organizations and public figures who have sought to distance themselves from him. According to the NOI, white people were created 6,000 years ago as a quote race of devils end quote by an evil scientist named Yakub, a story which originated with the founder of the NOI, Wallace D. Fard. So I bet a lot of people out there didn't know about this pseudoscientific aspect of the Nation of Islam, right? You just hear about it as an activist organization. But as so often happens with different groups, different organizations, they might have some aspects of them that actually sound okay if you see them written down on paper, but in a lot of cases they get this sort of pseudoscientific cult-like stuff going on, and they make some bizarre claims, sort of like, I don't know, a UFO cult might do, or the let's see, I'm trying to think of maybe Heaven's Gate or something like that. An evil scientist named Yakub or Jacob, maybe. I don't know. I don't know how that's pronounced. It kind of doesn't matter that much, does it? But at an event in Milwaukee in August 2015, so only 10 years ago, Farrakhan said white people deserve to die, and they know, so they think it's us coming to do it. So that was a quote from Farrakhan. He's also claimed that Jews are responsible for the pornography industry. He said that, most of the movies are run by members of the Jewish community. So, he's making the same sort of claims I would find white nationalists making. He's claimed that transgender people are the work of Satan because, of course, there could be no natural explanation for it. He stated, Satan wants you to, or wants to turn you so that God will reject you. Wow, there could be no other explanation for it, in terms of psychological explanations or cultural ones, even. It's just Satan at the core of it, right? And in that speech, he also flat out advocated for violence against different groups. So you have to wonder, is this the type of leader you want in charge of housing projects? Sending people to police buildings in your city. I kind of wouldn't want him doing that. And it's not just because of the things he said against one group. He said things against multiple groups. So as far as recent developments go, in 2019, Facebook banned Farrakhan from its platform. Back when it was doing that sort of thing, now it's just like a bit more of a frenzied free for all. Anything goes. They got rid of their fact checkers even, and they kind of made a big show of that because they wanted to appeal to the MAGA movement. But back then they cited violations of its policies against hate speech. It was seen as part of a broader effort by social media companies to address the spread of extremist content online. But now I guess that's all fine and good. There's been a change of heart with a change of administration. So, we'll see. We'll see what happens on Facebook in the near future. So, from my standpoint, the centralized and hierarchical structure of the NOI, along with Farrakhan's authoritarian leadership style, should be viewed critically, right? I'm not just saying this because I'm like bigoted against the guy or something. It's because he is in an actual leadership role. He is the head of an organization. He's making claims about, the society I live in. He's making claims about the universe I live in. So, anytime somebody makes claims about the world, you can actually debunk them, and it doesn't necessarily make you a bigot or anything like that. So, if you do think I have been unfair to him, go ahead and let me know how. And, I can respond perhaps, or just let your comments stand, but feel free to let me know. And if you're like me and typically advocate for relatively decentralized, non hierarchical forms of organization, you may see the NOI's structure as contradictory to such principles. Additionally, Farrakhan's nationalist ideology might be seen as reinforcing divisions rather than promoting the kind of solidarity across different groups that I would actually want. And of course, many of his claims are just not scientific at all. They're just strange. Moreover, his controversial statements and the resulting divisions they have sown could be viewed as counterproductive to the broader goals of social harmony and equality that progressives often strive for. The focus on a singular leader and the top down approach within the NOI may be seen as antithetical to values of collective decision making and mutual aid. So, Louis Farrakhan is a significant yet contentious figure in American society. His leadership of the Nation of Islam and his role in organizing the Million Man March are notable achievements in their own right, I suppose. If nothing else, we should acknowledge them historically, no matter how else we figure out, or think about them. His legacy is complicated by a history of divisive and offensive remarks that have deservedly drawn criticism from various quarters. Understanding his impact requires a nuanced examination of his contributions to black activism alongside the controversies that have marked his career and his movement forever. So I'm going to take a break. There's going to be a part two. Please tune in for that.